what could make 2,000 of Manhattan's wealthiest elite rise to their feet in thunderous applause for a man they'd mocked just minutes before the conductor's baton hung frozen in midair. 2,000 seats held a silence so profound you could hear the crystal chandeliers trembling above. And there, at that $90,000 Steinway grand piano, sat a man in a torn jacket and weathered boots, his hands scarred and calloused, resting on keys worth more than everything he owned. His eyes burned with something those diamond-draped guests couldn't purchase at any price. Just 5 minutes earlier, security had been dragging him toward the exit. The crowd had laughed. One woman had called him a disgrace. They'd demanded he be removed from their sight. But they didn't know that this man, this homeless stranger they'd dismissed with such contempt, carried within him a gift that would shatter every assumption in that opulent concert hall. And what happened next wouldn't just silence a room. It would change lives. Because sometimes the most extraordinary beauty lives in the places we are too blind to see. This is the true story of the night Manhattan's elite learned what real music sounds like. Before we understand what happened that night, you need to know who Tyrell Washington really was. Because the man in the torn jacket wasn't always homeless. 20 years earlier, his name had been spoken in the same breath as the greatest young pianists in America. Tyrell was born in the South Side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than applause. His mother, Sandra, worked double shifts as a nurse at Cook County Hospital. His father, Robert, repaired industrial machinery at a steel plant. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment that shook every time the L train passed. Money was tight. Opportunities were scarce. Hope for many in that neighborhood was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Sandra Washington had a secret weapon against despair. In the corner of their cramped living room sat an old upright piano inherited from Tyrell's grandmother. The keys were yellowed. Several notes stuck. The bench wobbled. But to 7-year-old Tyrell, it was magic. His mother noticed it first. While other children in the building played outside or watched cartoons, Tyrell would sit at that piano for hours, picking out melodies by ear. Songs he'd heard on the radio, hymns from church, theme songs from television shows. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew that when his fingers touched those keys, something inside him came alive. Sandra couldn't afford formal lessons, but she found a retired music teacher named Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 blocks away. Mrs. Patterson took one look at Tyrell's small hands dancing across her piano and said 6 words that would change everything. "This child is touched by God." She taught him for free. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, while his mother worked and his father picked up his younger sister Destiny from school, Tyrell walked to Mrs. Patterson's basement apartment and learned. Scales, chords, classical pieces that had been written centuries before he was born. Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, names that felt as distant from the South Side as the moon. By the time Tyrell turned 8, he could play Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 16 flawlessly. Mrs. Patterson entered him in the Chicago Young Musicians Competition. He was the only black child in the entire event. The judges watched this small boy in his Sunday best shoes his mother had polished until they gleamed shirt pressed with care, and they assumed he'd struggle through some simplified piece. Then he began to play. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. He won first place. The local news ran a story, "Southside Prodigy Stuns Classical Music World." The recognition opened doors Sandra Washington had only dreamed of. Scholarships, private lessons with prestigious teachers, invitations to perform at venues across the city. By 15, Tyrell had been accepted to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, one of the most selective conservatories in the world. Full scholarship. Room and board covered. His mother wept with joy. Robert Washington quit his job at the steel plant and moved the family to Philadelphia so they could be together. Sandra found work at Temple University Hospital. 12-year-old Destiny enrolled in middle school. They found a small house in West Philadelphia. It wasn't much, but they were together, and Tyrell was living his dream. At Curtis, Tyrell flourished. His professors called him once-in-a-generation talent. He practiced 8 hours a day. His technique was flawless. His emotional depth, especially in romantic pieces, moved audiences to tears. Everyone said the same thing: Tyrell Washington was destined for Carnegie Hall, for international acclaim, for greatness. He believed them. At 17, the world stretched before him like an endless symphony, every note perfect and full of promise. And then in one terrible night, the music stopped. It was a Friday evening in April. Tyrell had just finished a grueling practice session. His final recital before graduation was 3 weeks away. Scouts from major orchestras would be there. His future felt certain. His family had planned a celebration dinner at their favorite soul food restaurant in West Philly. Nothing fancy, just the 4 of them. His mother had the night off. His father had promised to leave work early. Destiny had spent the afternoon baking Tyrell's favorite sweet potato pie. They piled into their aging Honda Civic. His father drove. His mother rode passenger. Tyrell sat behind his father, Destiny beside him, already teasing him about the bow tie he'd have to wear at the recital. They were laughing. The radio played old Motown. The windows were down. Spring air filled the car. They never saw it coming. The gunfire erupted from nowhere, a drive-by shooting gang retaliation for something that had nothing to do with the Washington family. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Bullets tore through the driver's side, through the windshield, through the back seat. Robert slumped over the wheel. The car veered, crashed into a parked truck. Tyrell's ears rang. Smoke filled the air. He heard screaming his own voice, his mother's voice. And then he looked beside him. Destiny sat motionless, her eyes wide and vacant. Blood spread across her yellow dress. She was 12 years old. Tyrell grabbed her, tried to shake her awake. Destiny, Destiny, look at me. He pressed his hands against the wound in her chest, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. His hands, those hands that had played Mozart and Beethoven, those hands destined for greatness, were soaked in his sister's blood. Someone pulled him from the wreckage. Sirens screamed. Paramedics swarmed. Tyrell fought to stay with Destiny, but they pulled him back, strapped him to a gurney. His left hand throbbed with a pain he couldn't process. He looked down and saw it. A bullet had torn through his palm, shattering bone and tendon. At the hospital, the news came in waves of devastation. Destiny was dead on arrival. His mother, Sandra, had taken a bullet to the spine. She'd survive, but she'd never walk again. His father, Robert, had been shot in the head. He was in a coma. The doctors gave him a 5% chance of survival. And Tyrell's hand, the surgeons did what they could, but the damage was catastrophic. Shattered metacarpals, severed tendons, nerve damage that might never heal. They saved the hand, but they couldn't save what it had been made to do. "Will I be able to play?" Tyrell asked the surgeon, his voice barely a whisper. The surgeon, a kind woman with tired eyes, squeezed his shoulder. "Son, you'll be able to use your hand for everyday tasks, but professional piano, that level of precision and strength. I'm sorry, that part of your life is over." The words hit harder than any bullet. Robert Washington never woke from his coma. 6 weeks after the shooting with Sandra Washington in a wheelchair beside her son, they buried both her husband and her youngest child in the same ceremony. 2 caskets. 1 family destroyed. Tyrell was 18 years old, and his world had been reduced to ash. Curtis Institute, with profound regret, withdrew his scholarship. Without the ability to perform at the required level, he couldn't complete his degree. They expressed their sympathy. They offered counseling resources. But the message was clear. His future as a concert pianist was finished. The insurance money from his father's death barely covered the funeral expenses. Medical bills piled up his mother's ongoing care. Tyrell's hand surgeries and physical therapy. Sandra could no longer work. Disability payments weren't enough. They lost the house in West Philadelphia, moved to a 1-bedroom apartment, then to a studio, then to a shelter. Tyrell tried to adapt. He practiced daily, attempting to relearn how to play with his injured hand, but the pain was constant. His left hand could no longer execute the complex passages that had once been effortless. The speed was gone. The strength was gone. The precision that had defined him was gone. Worse than the physical pain was the phantom sensation. Sometimes in his sleep, he'd dream he was playing. His hands would move perfectly across imaginary keys, every note crystal clear. Then he'd wake up and remember. The dream would shatter. The reality would crush him. Depression consumed him like a slow-acting poison. He stopped going to physical therapy, stopped answering calls from concerned friends and teachers. His mother begged him to keep trying, but she was fighting her own battles, learning to live in a wheelchair, grieving her husband and daughter, watching her son disappear into darkness. When Tyrell turned 19, he started drinking. At first, just to sleep, then to numb the pain, then to forget. The alcohol made the guilt quieter, the guilt that he'd survived when destiny hadn't, that his hands had failed to save her, that he'd been too weak to protect his family. One morning, Tyrell woke up in the doorway of an abandoned building, empty bottles around him, no memory of how he'd gotten there. He went back to the shelter to find his mother. She wasn't there. The staff told him she'd been moved to a long-term care facility in New Jersey. Medicaid would cover it. They gave him the address. He never went. He told himself it was because he couldn't bear to let her see what he'd become. The truth was darker. He was drowning, and he didn't know how to save himself. The streets swallowed him. Philadelphia first, then he drifted. Atlantic City, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. Wherever he could survive. Shelters when beds were available, parks when they weren't. He did odd jobs, day labor, dishwashing, anything that didn't require him to be someone. Because Tyrell Washington, the prodigy, the future star, was dead. The man who remained was just a ghost. Somewhere around his 23rd birthday, Tyrell found himself in New York City. Manhattan, specifically. He'd heard the busking was better there, that tourists were generous. He scraped together enough for a keyboard 61 keys, battery-powered, bought from a pawn shop for $40. It wasn't a piano, but it was something. He set up in Washington Square Park and played for spare change. His injured hand limited what he could perform, but he adapted. Slower pieces, songs he could handle with modified technique. Nothing classical, those pieces reminded him too much of what he'd lost. He played jazz standards, old R&B, anything people might drop $1 to hear. The years blurred together. 23 became 25, became 30. His mother died when he was 32. He found out 3 weeks after the funeral from a letter forwarded through 5 different addresses. He sat on a bench in Washington Square Park and cried for 2 hours. Then he went back to playing. By the time Tyrell turned 40, he'd been homeless for more than 20 years. The prodigy was a fading memory, something that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. The man he'd become was invisible. People walked past him every day, dropped quarters in his case without making eye contact, treated him like part of the scenery. He'd accepted it. This was his life now. This was all he'd ever be. And then he met Raymond Thompson. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The air carried that crisp quality that signals the end of summer. Washington Square Park buzzed with the usual crowd: students, tourists, chess players, performers. Tyrell had claimed his usual spot near the fountain, his battered keyboard propped on a milk crate, his worn case open for donations. He was playing Bill Withers' Ain't No Sunshine. His fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease, the melody simple enough that his injured hand could manage. A few people had stopped to listen. A couple had dropped dollars in his case. It was a decent afternoon. Then Tyrell noticed the man. He stood about 15 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. Mid-50s black, wearing a well-tailored suit that seemed out of place in the park. But it wasn't his clothes that caught Tyrell's attention. It was the way he listened. Most people, if they stopped at all, would pause for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. They'd nod politely, drop some change, and move on. This man had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, completely still, his eyes closed, as if the music was the only thing in the world that mattered. When Tyrell finished the song, the man opened his eyes and walked over. He pulled out his wallet and placed a $20 bill in the case. "You have a gift," the man said. His voice was warm, but carried an undertone of sadness, as if he recognized something in Tyrell's playing that went beyond technique. Tyrell gave his standard response. "Thank you, sir. Appreciate it." The man didn't leave. "How long have you been playing all my life?" The answer came automatically, though Tyrell immediately wished he'd said something else, something less revealing. "I can tell." The man studied Tyrell's hands. "That's not an amateur's touch. You have formal training." Tyrell stiffened. Most people didn't notice. They heard street music and assumed street musician. But this man heard something else. Something Tyrell had tried to bury for 2 decades. Used to, Tyrell admitted. Long time ago. The man nodded as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "I'm Raymond Thompson. Friends call me Ray. I manage Carnegie Symphony Hall." Tyrell blinked. Carnegie Symphony Hall was one of Manhattan's premier venues. Not as famous as Carnegie Hall itself, but prestigious enough that Tyrell had once dreamed of performing there. "That's impressive," Tyrell said carefully. Ray smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I used to be a violinist, Juilliard trained. I was going to be the next Joshua Bell." He laughed softly. Life had different plans. "I have arthritis now, can barely hold a bow, but I still love music. That's why I do what I do." Something in Ray's confession unlocked something in Tyrell. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have music stolen from you. Curtis Institute, Tyrell heard himself say. "I was at Curtis." Before, he didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Ray's expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. "Tyrell Washington." It wasn't a question. "I remember. The South Side prodigy. You were all anyone could talk about. And then you just disappeared." The past 20 years hung in the air between them. All the explanations Tyrell could have given, all the reasons and excuses felt inadequate. So he said nothing. Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. He wrote something on the back and handed it to Tyrell. "We're hosting a charity gala this Friday. Major donors, board members, the usual crowd. There'll be a performance chamber orchestra, some solos, nothing too elaborate. If you wanted to come just to listen, to remember what it feels like to be in that space." He paused. "Sometimes we forget who we are. Maybe being around music again would help you remember." Tyrell took the card. On the front, Raymond Thompson Venue. Operations Manager, Carnegie Symphony Hall. On the back, Ray had written an address, and Friday, 7 p.m. "Just show up." "I don't think I belong there," Tyrell said quietly. Ray met his eyes. "Neither do I most days, but we show up anyway." For 3 days, that business card burned a hole in Tyrell's pocket. He pulled it out constantly, read the address, imagined what it would be like to walk into a place like Carnegie Symphony Hall. Then he'd remember his torn jacket, his worn boots, the way security guards looked at homeless people, and he'd shove the card back in his pocket. By Friday afternoon, he'd convinced himself it was a bad idea. What was he thinking? That he could just stroll into a gala attended by Manhattan's elite and somehow belong, that anyone would want him there. But as evening approached and he sat in his usual spot under the Washington Square arch, something gnawed at him. When was the last time he'd been inside a real concert hall? When was the last time he'd heard a live orchestra? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to remember what he'd once been? The sun was setting when Tyrell made his decision. He packed up his keyboard, walked to the public bathroom, and did what he could to make himself presentable. He washed his hands and face, combed his fingers through his graying hair. His clothes were still worn, still marked him as what he was, but they were the best he had. He walked the 32 blocks to Carnegie Symphony Hall. With each step, he considered turning back, but Ray's words kept echoing. Sometimes we forget who we are. Maybe being around music again would help you remember. The building appeared before him like something from another world, all glass and limestone glowing with warm light. Through the windows he could see chandelier. Well-dressed people moving through the lobby with champagne flutes and confident smiles, a world he no longer belonged to. Security guards flanked the entrance. Tyrell's steps slowed. This was a mistake. He should leave before he embarrassed himself. But then he saw Ray standing just inside the door, scanning the street as if looking for someone. Their eyes met. Ray's face broke into a genuine smile. "He walked outside, you came," Ray said, and there was real warmth in his voice. "I probably shouldn't have. You absolutely should have." Ray guided him toward the entrance. "Come on, let me show you what we've done with the place." As they approached the door, one of the security guards stepped forward, his hand raised. "Sir, this is a private event." Ray cut him off smoothly. "He's with me, Gerald. This is Mr. Washington, a friend and colleague." The guard hesitated clearly, uncomfortable, but Ray's position as venue manager carried weight. He stepped aside, though his disapproving gaze followed Tyrell through the door. Inside, the opulence was overwhelming. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, art on the walls that probably cost more than Tyrell had earned in his entire life. Men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns. The air smelled of expensive perfume and even more expensive wine. Tyrell felt every eye on him. Conversations paused mid-sentence as he passed. A woman clutched her purse tighter. A man whispered something to his companion, who laughed behind her hand. Ray guided him to a seat in the back corner of the concert hall, away from the main crowd. The performance starts in about 20 minutes. Chamber orchestra, then a piano soloist for the second half. Just let yourself listen. Forget everything else. Just listen." Tyrell nodded, unable to find words. Ray squeezed his shoulder and walked away, leaving Tyrell alone in his corner seat, surrounded by a world that had once been his and now felt impossibly distant. The lights dimmed, the conductor walked out to polite applause, the orchestra began to tune. And for the first time in 20 years, Tyrell Washington sat in a concert hall and prepared to hear real music again. The chamber orchestra played Vivaldi's Four Seasons. It was technically proficient, but emotionally hollow, the kind of performance that sounds impressive to people who don't really understand music, but leaves true musicians unmoved. Tyrell listened with the critical ear of someone who'd once played in ensembles like this. They were good, but they weren't transcendent. They were going through motions, hitting notes, fulfilling expectations. Around him, the audience applauded at the appropriate moments. Crystal champagne flutes clinked. During a pause between movements, conversations resumed at careful volumes, business deals being discussed, social hierarchies being negotiated, wealth performing for itself. Tyrell felt invisible in his corner, which suited him fine. He could observe without being observed. He could remember what it felt like to be in a space designed entirely for music, even if he no longer belonged there. The chamber orchestra finished to enthusiastic applause. The conductor bowed. The musicians filed off stage. House lights came up for intermission. That's when she appeared. Carolyn Whitmore walked to the center of the stage with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her right to be anywhere. Mid-40s blonde hair pulled into an immaculate twist, wearing a black Chanel gown that probably cost more than a car. Everything about her projected power and control. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the hall's acoustics. "I'm Carolyn Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Capital Management and chair of the Carnegie Symphony Hall Board of Directors. I want to thank you all for being here tonight." Applause rippled through the crowd. "As you know, tonight's gala supports our mission to bring classical music to underserved communities throughout New York." She smiled, and something about it seemed practiced perfect and completely hollow. "We believe that great art should be accessible to everyone, regardless of background or circumstance." Tyrell almost laughed at the irony. Here was a woman in a dress worth thousands, standing in a hall where tickets started at $200, talking about accessibility while surrounded by Manhattan's wealthiest elite. Tonight, Carolyn continued, "We've raised over $8 million for this cause. Your generosity will change lives." More applause. People seemed pleased with themselves, as if writing a check was the same as actually caring about the communities they claimed to serve. After intermission, we have a special treat. Renowned pianist Adrian Blackwell will perform selections from Chopin and Rachmaninoff. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Blackwell studied at the Royal Academy of Music and has performed at venues throughout Europe. We're incredibly fortunate to have him with us tonight. The crowd murmured approval. Carolyn basked in it, but Tyrell barely heard the rest of her speech. His attention had snagged on those names. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, the composers he'd once mastered, the pieces that had defined his youth. Hearing them played by someone else in this hall, while he sat invisible in the back row, it felt like watching someone else live the life that should have been his. The house lights dimmed again. Intermission was over. People returned to their seats, refreshed champagne in hand. The murmur of conversation faded to expectant silence. And then Tyrell saw him. Adrian Blackwell walked onto the stage, young, maybe 30, white, impeccably dressed. He bowed to the audience's applause, sat at the Steinway grand piano, adjusted the bench with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He placed his hands on the keys. The hall fell silent, and he began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major opus 9, number 2. It was technically perfect, every note precisely executed, the tempo appropriate, the dynamics correct. But it was missing something. There was no soul in it. No understanding of what Chopin had been feeling when he wrote those notes. It was beautiful the way a photograph of a sunset is beautiful, capturing the image, but missing the actual light. Tyrell closed his eyes and heard the piece as it should be played. He heard the longing in it, the bittersweet ache of beauty that can't last. His fingers twitched involuntarily, phantom playing on invisible keys, remembering muscle memory his injured hand could no longer fully execute. Around him, the audience was enraptured. They heard perfection and assumed that was enough. They didn't know what they were missing because they'd never known what real music sounded like. And in that moment, sitting in his corner seat with his worn jacket and calloused hands, Tyrell felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Anger. Not at Adrian Blackwell, who was doing his best, but at all of it, at the waste. At the injustice of a world where this technically proficient but emotionally empty performance was celebrated while he, someone who actually understood what those notes meant, was invisible. At a system that valued credentials and presentation over actual truth. At the cruel randomness that had stolen his future, while people like Carolyn Whitmore wrote checks and congratulated themselves for their generosity. The anger felt like waking up after 20 years of sleep. Adrian Blackwell finished the Chopin to thunderous applause. He bowed, smiled, and launched immediately into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The orchestra joined him. The piece surged and swelled, technically impressive, emotionally vacant. Tyrell stood up. He didn't plan it, didn't think about it. His body simply moved on its own, driven by that spark of anger that had become a flame. He walked down the aisle toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the acoustically perfect hall. People turned to look. Whispers started. A woman gasped. Security guards stationed at the sides of the hall began moving toward him. Tyrell didn't stop. He walked right up to the stage, stood at the edge, and watched Adrian Blackwell play. The pianist noticed him, faltered for a fraction of a second, but maintained his performance. The conductor shot a desperate look at security. 2 guards reached Tyrell, grabbed his arms. "Sir, you need to return to your seat." "That's not how it should be played," Tyrell said, his voice carrying through the hall. The music stopped. Adrian's hands froze above the keys. The orchestra ground to a confused halt. 2,000 people stared at the homeless man being restrained by security. Carolyn Whitmore stood up from her front row seat, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "What is going on here?" Ray appeared from the wings, moving quickly. "Carolyn, I can explain." "Explain." Her voice could have cut glass. "Explain why there's a vagrant disrupting our gala." "He's not a vagrant," Ray said firmly. "He's a musician." "A musician?" Carolyn's laugh was sharp and cruel. She looked Tyrell up and down, taking in his worn clothes, his weathered face, the hands scarred by time and hardship. This man is clearly homeless. Security should have never let him in here. Gerald. The head security guard approached, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Thompson vouched for him. I don't care who vouched for him." Carolyn turned her attention fully to Tyrell. "Sir, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is a private event. You have no right to be here, and you certainly have no right to interrupt our performance. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." The hall was silent, except for the whispers rippling through the crowd. People held up phones recording. This would be on social media within minutes, the homeless man disrupting a charity gala. Tyrell met Carolyn's gaze. 20 years of invisibility, of being dismissed and overlooked and treated as less than human, crystallized into this single moment. I said, that's not how it should be played. Carolyn's eyes narrowed. Excuse me, Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2. Tyrell gestured to the piano, to Adrian Blackwell, who sat frozen at the bench. It's technically correct, but it's empty. It's like someone reading words without understanding what they mean. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience. Some people laughed, this homeless man critiquing a Royal Academy-trained pianist. Others looked uncomfortable, as if they couldn't decide whether to be outraged or intrigued. Carolyn's face flushed red. How dare you? Mr. Blackwell is an internationally recognized artist. I'm sure he is, Tyrell interrupted. But he doesn't understand what he's playing. Rachmaninoff wrote this after years of depression and self-doubt. It's not just notes. It's a man fighting his way back to life. You can't play it with just technique. You have to feel it. And I suppose you're an expert. Carolyn's voice dripped with disdain. You standing there in your... She gestured vaguely at his clothes. In that condition, presuming to lecture us about classical music. I'm not lecturing, Tyrell said quietly. I'm just telling you the truth. Ray stepped forward. Carolyn, if you'd just let me explain. This is Tyrell Washington. He was Curtis Institute. I don't care if he was Juilliard and Yale combined, Carolyn snapped. Look at him, Raymond. Whatever he might have been, it's clear what he is now. And what he is now is someone who needs to leave this building immediately before I call the actual police. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Some people were standing now, trying to get a better view. Phones were everywhere, recording every moment. Tyrell could feel the weight of their judgment, their assumptions, their certainty that he was nothing more than what he appeared to be. But then something shifted inside him. Maybe it was the anger that had been building for 20 years. Maybe it was the memory of who he'd once been. Maybe it was simply that he'd spent 2 decades invisible, and now standing in front of 2,000 people, he refused to disappear quietly. You talk about bringing music to underserved communities, Tyrell said, his voice steady and clear. You give speeches about accessibility and opportunity, but you don't actually mean it, do you? You mean accessibility for people who look right, who act right, who fit your idea of who deserves art. Carolyn's jaw clenched. How dare you see someone like me and you assume I don't understand music, that I couldn't possibly have anything to offer? You don't even consider that maybe I know what I'm talking about, Mr. Washington, Ray said gently, putting a hand on his arm. Maybe we should, but Tyrell wasn't finished. 20 years of silence was pouring out of him. I was 17 when I got accepted to Curtis Institute, full scholarship. They said I was once-in-a-generation talent. My professor said I'd play Carnegie Hall, that I'd be one of the greats. His voice cracked slightly. That was my life. That was my future. And then it wasn't. He held up his left hand, showing the scars. You want to know what happened? My family was killed in a drive-by shooting. My 12-year-old sister died in my arms while I tried to save her. A bullet went through my hand, shattered it. The surgeon said I'd never play professionally again. The hall was dead silent now. Even Carolyn had gone still. I lost everything that night. My family, my career, my future. And for 20 years I've been invisible. People like you walk past people like me every single day and never see us. Never consider that we might have been something once, that we might still be something if anyone bothered to look. A woman in the front row was crying quietly. Others looked deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't what they'd come for. They'd come for champagne and tax deductions and the comfortable feeling of helping from a distance. They hadn't come to be confronted with actual suffering. Carolyn recovered her composure. That's a very tragic story, Mr. Washington. And I'm sorry for your losses, but that doesn't give you the right to disrupt our event and insult our performers. I'm not insulting anyone, Tyrell said. I'm just saying that music is more than just technical execution. It's truth. And you can't buy truth no matter how much money you donate. Fine, Carolyn said coldly. She gestured to the Steinway grand piano. You think you can do better? You think your sad story and your injured hand give you some special insight? Prove it. The challenge hung in the air. Ray grabbed Carolyn's arm. Carolyn, that's not necessary. She shook him off. No, Raymond. He's disrupted our entire gala. He's insulted our performer. He's claimed that we don't understand real music, so let him prove it. She turned back to Tyrell, her smile sharp and cruel. Play for us, Mr. Washington. Show us all this great truth you're talking about. And if you're as good as you claim, I'll personally apologize and make a donation in your name. Her voice grew harder. But when you fail, and we both know you will, you'll leave this building and never come back. You'll be banned from every venue in this city, and everyone here will have a very clear reminder of why we don't let just anyone walk in off the street. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people looked excited as if they were about to witness a spectacle. Others looked appalled at the cruelty of it, but no one intervened. Tyrell looked at the piano. $90,000 of perfect engineering. The same kind of instrument he'd played as a teenager when the world had been full of promise. His left hand throbbed, a constant reminder of its limitations. He could walk away. Should walk away. This was a trap. Even if he played well, they'd dismiss it. They'd find reasons to criticize. And if he played poorly, which was likely given his injury, and the fact that he hadn't played a real piano in 20 years, they'd humiliate him. Carolyn would make sure of it. But Ray was looking at him with something like hope. And somewhere in this crowd of 2,000 wealthy people, there might be one or two who actually wanted to hear what music could really sound like. Tyrell took a breath. Okay, he said quietly. I'll play. Security released their grip on Tyrell's arms. The guards stepped back, looking uncertain. Adrian Blackwell quietly left the piano bench, walking off stage with as much dignity as he could muster. The conductor and orchestra remained frozen, unsure whether to stay or leave. Carolyn gestured grandly at the piano. The stage is yours, Mr. Washington. The walk from the edge of the stage to the piano bench felt like walking through water. Every step required conscious effort. 2,000 pairs of eyes tracked his movement. He could feel their assumptions, their expectations. Most of them expected him to fail. Some probably hoped he would. It would confirm everything they believed about people like him. Tyrell reached the piano bench and stood beside it for a moment. The Steinway gleamed under the stage lights, all polished ebony and perfect keys. He placed his right hand on its surface, felt the cool smoothness. This instrument cost more than he'd ever possessed in his entire life. It was built for virtuosos, for perfection. He wasn't perfect anymore. Maybe he never had been. But he'd been real. Tyrell sat down. The bench was perfectly adjusted too high for him. He lowered it, the mechanical sound echoing in the silent hall. He positioned himself, rolled his shoulders, tried to release the tension that had turned his muscles to stone. His hands hovered above the keys. The left one ached, already anticipating the pain that would come with playing. The scars across his palm seemed to pulse with old trauma. He flexed his fingers, testing their range. Limited. Always limited. In the front row, Carolyn sat with her arms crossed, a satisfied smile on her face. She'd already won in her mind. This was just the formality of watching him fail before throwing him out. Ray stood in the wings, his expression anguished. He was probably regretting ever inviting Tyrell here. This was his fault, after all. His kindness had led to this moment of public humiliation. Tyrell closed his eyes, tried to find center, tried to remember what it had felt like to play before the shooting, before the loss, before the decades of survival that had worn him down to nothing. But he couldn't find that young man. That version of himself was gone dead in a Honda Civic on a Philadelphia street 20 years ago. So instead, he thought about what remained. The man he'd become, the streets he'd survived, the loss he carried, the music that had never quite left him even when everything else had. He thought about his mother working double shifts so he could have lessons, his father quitting his job to support his dreams, Destiny listening to him practice for hours, never complaining, Mrs. Patterson teaching him for free because she believed in him. He thought about 20 years of invisibility, 20 years of being dismissed and overlooked and treated as if he didn't matter, 20 years of carrying a gift no one wanted to receive. And then he thought about what Rachmaninoff must have felt writing this concerto. The depression, the self-doubt, the feeling of being broken beyond repair, and then the slow, painful crawl back to life, back to art, back to the thing that made living worthwhile. Tyrell opened his eyes. He placed his hands on the keys, both of them scars and all, and he began to play. The first note rang out crystal clear, a single tone that filled the entire hall, vibrating in that perfect acoustic space, carrying more weight than any sound should be able to carry. Then the second note. The third. The opening phrases of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, Major Opus 9, Number 2. The same piece Adrian Blackwell had played 20 minutes earlier. But this wasn't the same piece at all. Where Blackwell had been technically perfect, but emotionally empty, Tyrell played with the accumulated weight of 20 years of loss. His left hand struggled with some of the passages the injury prevented the fluid speed he'd once possessed. But what he'd lost in technical perfection, he'd gained in understanding. This wasn't just music. This was grief given voice. This was beauty emerging from brokenness. This was everything Chopin had meant when he wrote those notes. The longing for something lost, the bittersweet recognition that some things can never be recovered, the quiet dignity of continuing anyway. Tyrell's injured left hand moved across the keys with deliberate care. Where he couldn't play with speed, he played with intention. Where he couldn't execute technically complex passages, he simplified them, but in ways that somehow made them more emotionally resonant. The adaptation wasn't weakness, it was evolution. Music transformed by experience. The audience's whispers died. One by one, people stopped looking at their phones, stopped checking their watches, stopped thinking about anything except the sound filling the hall. In the front row, Carolyn's arms slowly uncrossed. Her satisfied smile faded. Something like confusion crossed her face. Ray, standing in the wings, had tears streaming down his face. 30 seconds into the piece, a woman in the third row began crying quietly. By the first minute, several others had joined her. This wasn't performance. This was confession. This was testimony. This was proof that music wasn't about perfect technique or proper credentials or belonging to the right circles. Music was about truth. And truth, it turned out, didn't care about your circumstances. It just required that you feel it and have the courage to share it. Tyrell reached the piece's most famous passage, a delicate descending melody that requires perfect control and touch. His injured hand trembled slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he might not be able to execute it. But then something remarkable happened. Instead of fighting the limitation, he leaned into it. The tremor in his hand created a subtle vibrato effect, a wavering quality that made the notes sound even more vulnerable and human. It was an accident of injury that became a choice, a weakness that became strength. The passage finished. No one breathed. And then Tyrell continued, his hands moving with increasing confidence. The pain in his left hand was excruciating. He could feel every old injury protesting, but he didn't care. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. He was doing the thing he'd been born to do. The Chopin Nocturne built toward its conclusion. Tyrell played the final notes with a tenderness that seemed impossible given the scarred, broken hand that produced them. The last note hung in the air for a long moment. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. No one moved. No one coughed. No one whispered. 2,000 people sat frozen, as if afraid that any sound might shatter whatever spell had just been cast. Tyrell lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap. His left hand was screaming with pain. He didn't care. The silence continued. 5 seconds. 10. 15. And then someone began to clap. Not a standing ovation. Not yet. Just one person clapping slowly, deliberately. Others joined. Then more. The applause built gradually like a wave gathering strength. But Tyrell wasn't finished. He placed his hands back on the keys. "That was Chopin," he said quietly, his voice somehow carrying through the hall's perfect acoustics. "Now let me show you Rachmaninoff." The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 crashed through the hall like a declaration of war. Where the Chopin had been delicate and introspective, the Rachmaninoff was massive, and overwhelming grief transformed into defiance, pain alchemized into power. Tyrell attacked the keys with everything he had. His right hand blazed through the complex passages. His left hand, limited though it was, provided the foundation. Where he couldn't match the original tempo, he adjusted, slowing certain sections to give them more weight, emphasizing different aspects of the melody, making the piece his own through necessity and choice. The conductor, who'd been standing motionless in shock, suddenly came alive. He turned to the orchestra, raised his baton, and signaled them to join in. The string section entered first, tentative, but quickly gaining confidence. Then the brass. The woodwinds. Within moments, the full orchestra was playing, following Tyrell's lead, adapting to his interpretations. This was the concerto, as it was meant to be performed not as a display of technical mastery, but as a conversation between piano and orchestra, between soloist and ensemble, between one man's pain and the collective human experience. Rachmaninoff had written this piece after years of depression and creative paralysis. He'd believed he'd never compose again. And then slowly, painstakingly, he'd found his way back to music. The concerto was his resurrection story, his proof that brokenness wasn't the end. Tyrell played it like a man who understood resurrection. Because he'd been dead for 20 years, not physically, but in every way that mattered, dead to hope, dead to possibility, dead to the person he'd once been. And now, somehow impossibly, he was coming back to life. The first movement surged and swelled. Tyrell's whole body moved with the music swaying, leaning into the crescendos, pulling back for the quieter moments. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His injured hand cramped and burned, but he pushed through. This wasn't about comfort. This was about truth. In the audience, something was happening. The emotional wall that separated performers from observers was dissolving. People weren't just watching anymore. They were participating. They were feeling. They were being transformed by what they heard. A CEO in the 5th row found himself thinking about the father he'd never reconciled with before the old man died. A society wife in the 8th row remembered the dreams she'd given up to marry well. A young man in the balcony thought about the art he'd abandoned for a more practical career. The music was cracking them open, forcing them to feel things they'd spent fortunes avoiding. Carolyn Whitmore sat rigidly in her front row seat, her face a mask of confusion and something that might have been fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. This homeless man wasn't supposed to be good. He certainly wasn't supposed to be transcendent. Every assumption she'd made was being destroyed by the sounds pouring from that piano. Ray had stopped crying. Now he just stood in awe. In his decades around classical music, he'd heard hundreds of performances, but he'd never heard anything like this. This wasn't just playing. This was prophecy. This was gospel. This was a man bearing witness to suffering and beauty and the terrible, wonderful persistence of the human spirit. The first movement built toward its climax. The orchestra swelled. Tyrell's hands flew across the keys, even the injured one moving beyond its supposed limitations, driven by something bigger than pain. The music grew louder, bigger, more powerful, until it seemed impossible that one piano and one orchestra could contain so much feeling. And then at the perfect moment, Tyrell pulled it back. The volume dropped. The intensity focused. What had been overwhelming became intimate. This was Rachmaninoff's genius, knowing when to overwhelm and when to whisper. And Tyrell understood it completely. The movement ended with a single sustained chord. Tyrell held it, letting it ring through the hall until it faded to nothing. Silence again. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the awkward quiet of people unsure how to react. This was the silence of people afraid to break a sacred moment. Someone in the balcony whispered, "Oh my God." It was the only sound in the entire hall. Tyrell took a breath. His hands were shaking now. His left hand felt like it was on fire. He'd probably done permanent damage pushing it this far. He didn't care. He'd forgotten what this felt like. The total immersion. The complete surrender to music. The feeling of channels opening between himself and something larger, music flowing through him rather than from him. He'd forgotten what it meant to be alive. The second movement began. If the first movement had been about power, the second movement was about vulnerability. Rachmaninoff's Adagio Sostenuto, one of the most beautiful melodies ever written. Simple on the surface, devastating in its emotional honesty. Tyrell played it like a prayer. His hands moved with a gentleness that seemed impossible given their scars and damage. Each note was carefully shaped, given space to breathe, allowed to carry its full emotional weight. This wasn't about showing technical mastery. This was about laying yourself bare, about admitting that you've been broken and showing the cracks where the light gets in. The orchestra followed his lead. The strings played with aching tenderness. The woodwinds wove quiet harmonies. Everything was subtle, restrained, focused on serving the emotional truth of the piece rather than showcasing individual talent. In the audience, people were openly weeping now. Not just one or two, dozens, then hundreds. Tears streaming down faces, bodies shaking with sobs that were both grief and relief. The music was giving them permission to feel things they'd buried, to remember losses they'd tried to forget, to acknowledge the ways they'd been broken. A man in his 60s cried for the wife he'd lost to cancer. A young woman sobbed for the abortion she'd never discussed with anyone. A teenager wept for reasons he couldn't name, just the overwhelming sense that something in his life had been missing, and he'd finally found it. Carolyn Whitmore's hands gripped the armrests of her seat. Her knuckles were white. Her jaw was clenched. She was fighting it, fighting the emotion, fighting the recognition that everything she'd believed was being challenged. But she couldn't fight it forever. A single tear slid down her cheek, then another. And then, like a dam breaking, she was crying too. great gulping sobs that shook her entire body. 20 years of pretense and performance and maintaining appearances crumbled under the weight of 3 minutes of honest music. Ray had moved closer to the stage. He stood at the edge, watching Tyrell play, and the look on his face was pure wonder. He'd spent decades in the music world. He'd managed venues, worked with famous performers, heard countless concerts. But he'd never witnessed anything like this. This wasn't just exceptional. This was sacred. Tyrell reached the movement's most famous passage, a melody so beautiful it almost hurts to hear. His injured left hand struggled with some of the accompaniment, but he compensated with his right, redistributing the notes, adapting the fingering, making it work through sheer will and decades of instinct. And something remarkable happened. The struggle. The obvious difficulty, the visible pain, the adaptation required by his injury made the music more powerful, not less. It was the sound of someone refusing to let brokenness be the end of the story. The sound of continuing despite pain. The sound of beauty emerging not in spite of suffering, but because of it. The melody climbed higher. Tyrell's fingers found each note with precision that seemed miraculous given the damage to his hand. The orchestra swelled beneath him, supporting but never overwhelming. For 3 minutes, 2,000 people and 100 musicians were unified in one purpose, serving this piece of music, honoring what Rachmaninoff had created, and bearing witness to what Tyrell Washington was revealing. The movement drew to a close. The final notes hung in the air, delicate, fragile, perfect. Silence fell again. But now the silence felt holy. The entire hall had become a cathedral, and everyone in it had just witnessed something approaching divinity. No one applauded. It would have been sacrilege. Tyrell sat at the piano, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly. Tears ran down his face. He made no attempt to hide them. After 20 years of numbness, of emotional shutdown, of survival mode, he was finally feeling again. And it hurt. God, it hurt. But it was the good kind of pain, the kind that meant you were still alive. He took several deep breaths, trying to compose himself. His left hand was screaming now. He could barely feel his fingers. But there was one more movement. The finale. The resurrection. The proof that suffering doesn't have to be the end of the story. He looked up, made eye contact with the conductor, who nodded, tears in his own eyes. Tyrell turned back to the piano, placed his broken, scarred, beautiful hands on the keys one more time, and played the finale. The third movement exploded into being. Where the first movement had been powerful and the second vulnerable, the third was triumphant. It was Rachmaninoff saying, "I was broken, and I came back." It was every resurrection story ever told. It was proof that the darkness doesn't get the last word. Tyrell played it with everything he had left. His hands moved in a blur, even the injured one pushing far beyond what medical science said was possible, driven by will and muscle memory, and something that might have been grace. The pain was extraordinary. He could feel something tearing in his left palm, some old injury reopening. Blood would probably be necessary later. None of it mattered. This was it. This was what he'd been born to do. And if he destroyed his hand completely in the process, it would be worth it. Because for these few minutes, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't dismissed. He wasn't the homeless man people walked past without seeing. He was Tyrell Washington, and he was reminding 2,000 people what music could really be. The orchestra matched his intensity. The conductor gave up trying to lead, he was just following now, letting Tyrell dictate the tempo, the dynamics, the emotional arc. The musicians played like their lives depended on it, because in a strange way they did. They'd been performing by rote, for so long executing notes without really understanding them. Now they were actually making music. Now they remembered why they'd chosen this profession in the first place. The piece built and built. Rachmaninoff was a master of the climax, and this concerto's finale was one of his finest achievements, wave after wave of musical and emotional intensity, each surge bigger than the last, driving toward a conclusion that felt both inevitable and impossible. Tyrell's entire body was involved now. He rocked forward and back. His shoulders moved with the rhythm. His face showed every emotion the music contained. Pain, joy, anger, hope, grief, triumph, all of it cycling through in rapid succession. This was what total commitment looked like, what artistic honesty required. In the audience, people had stopped crying. Now they just stared, transfixed. Some held hands with strangers. Some stood up without realizing it. Some closed their eyes and swayed. The experience had moved beyond concert and become something closer to revival. They weren't just hearing music. They were being changed by it. Carolyn Whitmore stared at Tyrell with an expression that was half wonder, half horror. Because she understood now. She understood what she'd almost destroyed. She understood the cruelty of her assumptions. She understood that everything she'd built her identity on, wealth, status, credentials, appearance, meant nothing compared to this. This truth. This beauty. This broken man playing broken music with his broken hands and revealing more beauty than she'd ever created with all her power and money. Ray was openly weeping again, but now his tears were joyful. Because he'd been right. He'd recognized something in Tyrell that day in Washington Square Park. Something that couldn't be hidden by worn clothes or weathered skin. The gift. The calling. The thing that made someone irreplaceable. The music accelerated. The final climax approached. Tyrell's hands blazed across the keys in patterns so complex they seemed impossible. His left hand, the supposedly ruined one, was performing miracles. Years of adaptation, of learning to work around limitations, had created something unique. He couldn't play exactly the way he had at 17, but what he could play now, at 40, with 20 years of suffering and survival, informing every note, that was something his 17-year-old self could never have achieved. The orchestra hit the penultimate crescendo, every instrument at full volume. The sound was overwhelming, glorious, too big for the hall to contain. It poured out in waves, washing over the audience, drowning them in sound and emotion. And then, at the absolute peak, Tyrell made a choice. Instead of following Rachmaninoff's written finale exactly, he began to improvise. He took the themes, the melodies and harmonies Rachmaninoff had composed and wove them into something new, something that incorporated his own story, his own pain, his own resurrection. The orchestra, confused at first, followed his lead. The conductor gave up entirely, just let it happen, trusting Tyrell's instinct. What emerged was transcendent. It was Rachmaninoff, but also something beyond Rachmaninoff. It was classical music transformed by jazz inflections, by blues tonality, by the street musician's understanding of how to speak directly to human hearts. It was sophisticated and raw-trained, and instinctive, European and American, past and present, all at once. It was 20 years of invisibility given voice. It was every homeless person who'd been walked past and ignored, every dismissed artist, every broken dreamer, all of them speaking through Tyrell's scarred hands. It was proof that art doesn't belong to institutions or wealthy patrons or proper society. Art belongs to anyone willing to tell the truth. The improvisation built to its own climax. Tyrell played chords that shouldn't have been possible, with his injury reached for notes at the extreme ends of the keyboard, used every bit of the instrument's range and his own body's capacity. Blood was definitely flowing now. He could feel it warm and wet on the keys. He didn't stop. And then, with one final massive chord that used every functioning finger he possessed, he brought it all to a close. The sound rang out, filled the hall, vibrated in every person's chest, and then faded into silence. Perfect. Absolute. Silence. For 30 seconds, no one moved. Tyrell sat at the piano. His head bowed, his hands still resting on the keys. Blood stained some of the white keys red. His entire body trembled with exhaustion and pain, and the aftershock of total emotional expenditure. He'd given everything. There was nothing left. The orchestra sat, frozen instruments ready but silent. The conductor stood with his arms lowered, baton hanging loosely, his face streaked with tears. In the audience, 2,000 people struggled to process what they'd just experienced. It was too big, too much, too real. They'd come for an evening of polite entertainment for the social performance of charity and culture. They'd expected pleasant music and good wine and the comfortable feeling of being sophisticated. Instead, they'd been cracked open. They'd been forced to feel. They'd been confronted with truth in a form so undeniable they couldn't rationalize it away. Ray stood at the edge of the stage, hands pressed to his mouth, tears streaming down his face. He'd known Tyrell was gifted, but he hadn't known this. He hadn't known that the man he'd found playing a battered keyboard in Washington Square Park could do this. Carolyn Whitmore sat rigidly in her front row seat, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. Mascara ran down her cheeks, her hands shook. Everything she'd believed about merit and worth and who deserved to be heard had been demolished in 40 minutes. She'd been so certain, so sure of her judgments, and she'd been catastrophically wrong. The silence continued. 10 more seconds. 20. And then from the balcony, one person stood up. An older black woman wearing a modest dress, definitely not one of the wealthy donors. Probably someone's plus one, or maybe she'd bought one of the few cheap seats the hall offered. She stood up and began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. Her applause rang out in the silence like church bells. A man in the orchestra pit set down his violin and stood adding his applause to hers. Then someone else, and another, and another. Within 10 seconds, the entire hall was standing. Within 20, they were applauding with a fervor that bordered on violence. The sound was deafening, 2,000 people trying to express the inexpressible, trying to thank Tyrell for what he'd just given them. But it wasn't enough. Applause wasn't enough for what they'd just experienced. Someone shouted, "Bravo." Others picked it up. "Bravo, bravo." People were crying and applauding simultaneously. Strangers embraced. The CEO in the 5th row hugged the person next to him, someone he'd never met. The society wife in the 8th row clutched her husband's hand with desperate intensity, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The applause built and built. Some people stamped their feet. Others whistled. The orchestra members stood and applauded too, their professional reserve completely abandoned. And through it all, Tyrell sat at the piano, head bowed, unable to process what was happening. He'd expected humiliation. He'd expected to be proven inadequate and thrown out. Instead, 2,000 people were giving him the kind of ovation usually reserved for world-famous soloists at the end of international tours. Ray rushed onto the stage. He wrapped Tyrell in a fierce embrace, not caring about the blood on his hands or the sweat staining his shirt. "You did it," Ray whispered. "My God, you did it." Tyrell couldn't speak, could barely breathe. 20 years of numbness was giving way to feeling, and the sensation was overwhelming. Joy and pain and grief and triumph all cascading through him at once. The applause continued. 2 minutes. 3. People didn't want to stop, didn't want to return to their regular lives. They wanted to stay in this moment where they'd remembered what it felt like to be fully human. Finally, slowly, the ovation began to fade. People sat down exhausted by the intensity of their own reaction. But the energy in the room remained electric. Everyone knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary, something they'd tell people about for the rest of their lives. Tyrell finally lifted his head, looked out at the audience, saw their faces, so many faces, all looking at him not with pity or dismissal or contempt, but with recognition. They saw him now, really saw him. And in the front row, Carolyn Whitmore sat with her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The house lights came up gradually, as if the building itself was reluctant to break the spell. People moved slowly, dazed, as if waking from a dream. Conversations started in whispers and gradually grew louder, but there was a reverence to them. No one wanted to shatter what had just happened with careless words. Ray helped Tyrell stand from the piano bench. His legs were unsteady. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was fading, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and the full awareness of his injuries. His left hand was swollen and bleeding, the old scars reopened by the strain. "We need to get that looked at," said gently, examining the hand. "Later," Tyrell managed. His voice was hoarse. I need a minute." People were already approaching the stage. Not the security guards who'd tried to remove him earlier. They'd disappeared, probably embarrassed. These were audience members, donors, the very people who'd laughed at him 30 minutes before. An elderly man in an expensive tuxedo reached the stage first. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to apologize. The way I looked at you when you first stood up, the things I was thinking. I'm ashamed of myself." A woman in a designer gown stood beside him, mascara streaked down her face. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us." More people crowded forward. Business cards were pressed into Ray's hands, venue managers, booking agents, orchestra directors, all wanting to offer Tyrell opportunities. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell his story. A music school offered to fund his return to formal study. A recording studio wanted to produce an album. Tyrell heard their voices as if from a great distance. The offers, the praise, the sudden reversal from contempt to admiration. It was too much, too fast. An hour ago, he'd been invisible. Now everyone wanted a piece of him. Through the crowd, he saw someone approaching the stage with slower, more hesitant steps. Carolyn Whitmore. Her face was blotchy from crying. Her perfect hair had come loose from its pins. Her Chanel gown seemed less impressive now, just expensive fabric doing nothing to protect her from the truth. She looked small, vulnerable, human. She reached the stage and stood at the edge, looking up at Tyrell. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Couldn't speak. Finally, "Mr. Washington." Her voice cracked. She started again. "There are no words," No apology adequate for what I said to you, how I treated you, the assumptions I made. Tyrell said nothing, just waited. I pride myself on supporting the arts. Carolyn continued, each word clearly difficult, on recognizing talent, on bringing music to people who need it. And when talent stood right in front of me, when someone who truly understood what music means tried to share that gift, I tried to have him thrown out. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I saw your clothes instead of your hands. I saw where you'd come from instead of who you were. I saw everything except what mattered. She looked directly at him now. You asked me earlier if I meant what I said about accessibility, about bringing music to underserved communities. I thought I did. I thought writing checks and attending galas made me an advocate. But you showed me tonight that I don't understand anything about what I'm supposedly supporting. Tyrell's throat was tight. Part of him wanted to accept her apology gracefully to let her off the hook. But another part, the part that had spent 20 years being dismissed and overlooked, needed her to fully understand. Do you know how many times I've been invisible? He said quietly. How many people have walked past me on the street, looked through me like I was nothing? Your security tried to throw me out before I even spoke. You made your judgment in seconds. I know, Carolyn whispered. I know. And I can't undo it. I can't take back what I said or how I made you feel. All I can do is tell you that I'm sorry, and I'm going to be different. Ray had cleared most of the crowd away, giving Tyrell and Carolyn space to talk. The hall was emptying slowly. People reluctant to leave, still processing what they'd witnessed. The orchestra had packed up and departed. The stage lights had been dimmed to half. Carolyn took a breath, seemed to steady herself. I want to make you an offer. Not because I'm trying to buy your forgiveness, I don't expect forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. She pulled out her phone, opened an app, and showed Tyrell the screen. This is my personal banking. I'm transferring $500,000 to an account in your name. No strings, no conditions. It's yours to do with as you wish. Tyrell stared at the screen, unable to process the number. $500,000. More money than he'd seen in his entire life. Additionally, Carolyn continued, I'm establishing a residency program at Carnegie Symphony Hall. You'll be our artist in residence. Full medical coverage for your hand, the best surgeons, the best physical therapy. An apartment in the city rent-free. Access to practice facilities whenever you want. And opportunities to perform if and when you're ready. She scrolled through more information. I'm also founding a scholarship fund in your name for musicians from underserved communities, people who've faced barriers, people like you. We'll identify talent in places we've been ignoring and we'll give them the support they need. Real support, not just money, but mentorship access opportunities. Ray had moved closer, listening intently. His expression was complicated pride in Tyrell, but also wariness about Carolyn's sudden transformation. Tyrell looked at Carolyn's phone, then at her face. Why? Because I was wrong, she said simply. Because the way we do things, the way I've been doing things, is broken. We claim to support art, but we only support artists who look right, who come from the right backgrounds, who have the right credentials. We've created a system that excludes the very people who might have the most important things to say. She lowered the phone. What you played tonight that wasn't just technically proficient music. That was truth. That was lived experience transformed into sound. That's what art is supposed to be. And I've been so busy maintaining systems and protecting institutions that I forgot what we're supposed to be in service of. Tyrell was silent for a long moment. The offer was everything he'd lost 20 years ago. Security support, recognition, opportunity. Everything his 17-year-old self had dreamed of. It was justice. It was vindication. It was the universe correcting a cosmic wrong. But something about it didn't sit right. Ms. Whitmore, he said slowly. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want your money to be about me." Carolyn looked confused. "I don't understand. The scholarship fund, the residency program, those are good ideas, but they can't be about making you feel better about tonight. And they can't be about turning me into some kind of symbol or success story." Tyrell gestured at the empty hall around them. "What happened here tonight was important because it revealed something true. If you turn it into a charity case or a redemption narrative, you miss the point." He took a breath, trying to articulate something he'd never fully formed into words before. "I'm not special because I rose above my circumstances. I'm not inspirational because I survived. I'm just someone who had a gift and lost almost everything but managed to keep that one thing. There are hundreds of people like me out there. Thousands. People with gifts who never get the chance to share them because of where they live, or what they look like, or what happened to them. That's exactly why I want to help," Carolyn said. "I know. But help means more than money. It means actually changing how we think about who deserves to be heard. It means looking at people you'd normally walk past and actually seeing them." Tyrell held up his scarred left hand. "This hand is broken. It'll never play the way it did when I was 17. But tonight it played something those people needed to hear. Not despite its brokenness. Because of it." Ray spoke up for the first time. "What are you saying, Tyrell?" "I'm saying I'll accept the medical care. I'll take the scholarship fund if we do it right, if we actually find people who've been overlooked and give them real chances. But I don't want an apartment. I don't want to be an artist in residence at some prestigious hall." He looked at Carolyn. "Because that would make me part of the system that excludes people like me. It would make me safe. Acceptable. One of the good ones." "Where will you live?" Carolyn asked, genuinely confused. "Same places I've been living. I'll find something." Tyrell smiled slightly. "I've survived 20 years. I'll survive." "But you don't have to just survive anymore," Ray protested. "You could actually live. Really live." "I know. And maybe eventually I will. But right now the most important thing isn't my comfort. It's making sure tonight mattered. Making sure it changes something beyond just my individual story." He turned back to Carolyn. "So here's what I want. Use that money to create real change. Fund programs in neighborhoods that never see classical music. Hire people who look like me to be teachers and administrators and decision makers. Make these spaces actually accessible, not just performatively diverse. And let me help with that. Not as your poster child, but as someone who knows what it's like to be on the outside." Carolyn nodded slowly. "I can do that. We can do that. Good." Tyrell extended his right hand, his good hand. "Then we have an agreement." They shook on it. And in that moment something shifted. This wasn't a powerful benefactor rescuing a homeless musician. This was two people committing to actually changing something broken. Over the next hour, as the hall emptied completely, the three of them sat in the front row and began planning. Carolyn took notes on her phone. Ray contributed ideas from his decades in the music world. Tyrell spoke about the communities that had been ignored, the talented people he'd met on the streets, the systemic barriers that kept art separated from the people who needed it most. A venue manager appeared to tell them the building needed to close. Carolyn waved him off. "It can wait." They talked about specific programs. Carolyn suggested partnering with homeless shelters to offer free music lessons. Tyrell countered that they needed to do more than offer charity. They needed to hire people from those communities as teachers and staff. Ray proposed creating a program that didn't require formal auditions, since auditions themselves were a barrier that excluded people who'd never had access to training. "We should bring instruments into parks," Tyrell said. "Set up pianos in public spaces, let anyone play. You'd be surprised how much talent you'd find. Street performances," Ray added excitedly. "Not just tolerating them, but actively supporting them. What if we had Carnegie Symphony Hall musicians playing in subway stations alongside the people who are already there? Carolyn typed rapidly. Yes, all of that. We'll need to restructure the entire board. Bring in people with lived experience, not just wealthy donors. That's going to be hard, Ray warned. People with power don't like giving it up. I know. Carolyn looked up from her phone, met his eyes. I'll resign if I have to. Tonight showed me that I've been part of the problem. Maybe someone else should be leading this. Don't resign, Tyrell said. Use the access you have. Use your relationships and resources, but be willing to listen to people who've been excluded. That's how you create real change. They continued planning until nearly midnight. Security finally insisted they had to leave. As they walked out into the Manhattan night, Tyrell felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Not naive hope, not the kind that ignores reality, but the earned hope of someone who'd survived the worst and discovered that transformation was still possible. Carolyn ordered a car service for all of them. Ray started to give the driver Tyrell's address, then realized he didn't know it. Tyrell provided the address of the shelter he'd been staying at. The driver's expression flickered with judgment. Carolyn noticed. That address is fine, she said firmly. They rode in silence for a while. Then Carolyn spoke. Mr. Washington Tyrell, I meant what I said about medical care for your hand. I have a friend who's an orthopedic surgeon at Hospital for Special Surgery. World-renowned. He owes me a favor. I could get you an appointment this week. Tyrell looked at his swollen left hand, the blood dried between his fingers. Thank you. I'll think about it. It's not charity, Carolyn said gently. You earned this tonight. You gave us something priceless. Let us give you something in return. She's right, Ray added. You played through incredible pain tonight. You don't have to keep suffering to prove a point. Tyrell smiled slightly. I'm not trying to prove a point. He trailed off, searching for words. For 20 years, pain was the one thing that felt real. The one thing that reminded me I was still alive. I'm not sure who I am without it. Maybe that's something you get to find out, Ray suggested. The car pulled up to the shelter. Tyrell reached for the door handle, then paused. Thank you both. For tonight. For believing I was worth listening to. Thank you, Carolyn said, her voice thick with emotion, for not giving up on music. For keeping that gift alive, even when everything else was taken from you. Tyrell nodded and stepped out of the car. He watched them drive away, then turned and walked into the shelter. The night manager barely looked up, just another homeless man coming in late. No recognition, no acknowledgement of where he'd been or what he'd done. It was strangely comforting. He was still himself. Still Tyrell Washington, homeless pianist. The performance tonight hadn't magically fixed his life or erased 20 years of trauma. But it had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. He still mattered. His gift still had value. And sometimes, even broken things can create beauty. He climbed the stairs to the dormitory floor, claimed an empty bunk, and lay down fully clothed. His left hand throbbed. His entire body ached. But underneath the pain, there was something else. Something that felt almost like peace. For the first time in 20 years, Tyrell Washington fell asleep with a smile on his face. The line outside Carnegie Hall stretched around the block. Every ticket had sold out within hours of going on sale. The official event was billed as an evening with Tyrell Washington's second chances and second acts. Inside the hall's green room, Tyrell sat at a mirror adjusting his bow tie. His hands, both of them, moved with increasing ease. The surgery had been successful. Months of physical therapy had restored much of his left hand's function. He'd never play exactly as he had at 17. But he could play. Really play. And the adaptations he'd developed during his years on the street had become part of his style, something unique that no formally trained pianist could replicate. Ray knocked on the door and entered without waiting for an answer. 5 minutes. You ready? As ready as I'll ever be. Tyrell stood straightening his tuxedo. It fit perfectly tailored specifically for him, paid for by the scholarship fund that now bore his name. He'd initially refused, but Carolyn had pointed out that if he was going to be the public face of the program, he should look the part. The kids get what they need first, though, he'd insisted. She'd agreed. How's the hand? Ray asked. Tyrell flexed his left fingers. Good. Still some stiffness, but manageable. Dr. Chen says I'm healing better than expected. That's what happens when you actually follow medical advice instead of playing through damaged tendons for 20 years. I was busy surviving. Well, you're busy living now. Different requirements. A knock on the door. Carolyn entered, looking nervous in a way Tyrell had never seen before. There are reporters everywhere. NPR wants an interview. The Times is doing a feature. Someone from 60 Minutes called. All publicity for the scholarship fund, Tyrell said calmly. He'd learned over the past 6 months how to navigate media attention without losing himself in it. That's what matters. I know, but... Carolyn took a breath. Tyrell, the board, approved the proposal. All of it. We're hiring 4 new staff members from communities that have been underserved. We're partnering with 10 homeless shelters across the city. We're putting pianos in 15 public parks starting next month. And we're restructuring the entire board to include people with lived experience of the barriers we're trying to remove. Ray grinned. That's incredible. It's a start, Tyrell said. But he smiled too. Real change. Not just words or money, but actual structural transformation. It was more than he'd dared hope for 6 months ago. Another knock. A young woman poked her head in one of the new staff members hired specifically because she'd been homeless herself and understood what that community needed. Mr. Washington, your guests are here. Send them in. The door opened wider, and 3 people entered. The first was the elderly black woman who'd been the first to stand and applaud that night 6 months ago. Her name was Dorothy Jenkins, and she'd become something of a mentor to Tyrell, helping him navigate his sudden visibility while staying grounded. The second was a young man named Jesse, 19 years old, who Tyrell had discovered playing keyboard in Washington Square Park 3 months earlier. He had raw talent and 0 formal training. The scholarship fund was now supporting his education at Manhattan School of Music. The third was a middle-aged white woman named Patricia, a former concert violinist who'd lost everything to addiction and was now 2 years sober. She'd be performing the opening piece tonight, proof that the scholarship fund wasn't just words, but was actually creating opportunities for overlooked musicians. You all set? Dorothy asked Tyrell, her warm voice full of pride. I think so. Terrified, but ready. That's how you know it matters, she said. Jessie was practically bouncing with excitement. There are so many people out there, and I saw the piano. It's even nicer than the one you played last time. It's the same piano, Tyrell said with a smile. The Steinway. You'll play it someday. Really. Really. You've got the gift, Jessie. You just need the opportunity. Patricia stood quietly to the side, her violin case clutched to her chest. She still carried the nervousness of someone who'd lost everything and was afraid of losing it again. Tyrell walked over to her. You're going to be amazing tonight, he said gently. What if I mess up? Then you mess up, and you keep playing anyway. That's what music is, continuing despite the mistakes. She nodded, taking strength from his certainty. A stage manager appeared in the doorway. Mr. Washington, we're ready for you. This was it. 6 months ago, he'd played this hall as an act of defiance and desperation. Tonight he was playing as an artist, with support, with recognition, with the knowledge that his music mattered not just in spite of his past, but because of it. They walked together toward the stage, Tyrell, Ray, Carolyn, Dorothy, Jessie, and Patricia. An unlikely family brought together by music and circumstance, and a shared belief that art belonged to everyone, not just the privileged few. As Tyrell stepped into the wings and heard the audience beyond a sold-out crowd that included everyone from Manhattan socialites to people from the shelters he'd slept in, he felt that same spark he'd felt 6 months ago. The anger had transformed into purpose, the pain into art, the brokenness into something unexpectedly beautiful. The stage lights came up. The audience applauded before he even appeared. He took a breath, said a quiet prayer of thanks to his mother and father and destiny, and stepped onto the stage. The applause was thunderous. Tyrell Washington didn't play Carnegie Hall that night exactly the way anyone expected. He performed some classical pieces, the Rachmaninoff, of course, and some Chopin and Debussy. But he also played jazz standards. He played hymns his mother used to sing. He played a piece he'd composed himself, inspired by the sounds of the city that had been his home for 20 years. Between pieces, he talked. He told his story not as a tragedy or a triumph, but as a simple truth. He introduced Patricia, who played a violin solo that brought the audience to tears. He brought Jessie on stage and let him play a short piece, the kid's nervous energy transforming into confident musicianship the moment his hands touched the keys. And at the end of the night, Tyrell made an announcement. The scholarship fund had raised enough money to support 50 musicians in its first year. 50 people who'd been overlooked or dismissed or told they didn't belong would get the support they needed to share their gifts. Music doesn't belong to concert halls, Tyrell told the audience. It doesn't belong to people with the right credentials or the right background. Music belongs to anyone willing to listen and anyone brave enough to speak their truth through sound. What happened to me, the recognition, the opportunities, shouldn't be rare. It should be normal. Everyone deserves to be heard. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. Later, after the crowds had dispersed and the hall had emptied, Tyrell walked out into the Manhattan night. He didn't have a car waiting. Didn't need one. He'd moved into a modest apartment in Washington Heights. Nothing fancy, but it was his. The scholarship fund had helped with the deposit, but he was paying rent from money he'd earned giving lessons and occasional performances. He walked through the city, his city, the place that had both destroyed and saved him. Past Washington Square Park, where Ray had first heard him play. Past the shelter where he'd spent so many nights. Past the spots where he'd been invisible for 2 decades. And then he did something he'd been meaning to do for months. He walked to a music store that stayed open late, went inside, and bought a simple keyboard. Not the battered pawn shop one he'd used for years, that one had a place of honor in his apartment now. This was a new one, decent quality, portable. He carried it to Washington Square Park, even though it was nearly midnight, set it up in his old spot, plugged in the battery, and began to play. Within minutes, people gathered. Night shift workers, insomniacs, students, tourists, the invisible people who populated the city after dark. They stood in a circle and listened. Some recognized him from the news coverage. Most didn't. It didn't matter. Tyrell played for an hour. When he finished and packed up his case, held $73 in donations. He took half of it and gave it to a homeless man sleeping on a nearby bench. "For breakfast," he said. The man looked confused. "Aren't you that pianist?" "The famous one, I'm a street musician," Tyrell said with a smile. "Just like you might be an accountant or a father or 1,000 other things besides someone who's homeless. We're all more than the boxes people put us in." He walked home through the empty streets, the keyboard on his shoulder, the remaining money in his pocket. He had surgery follow-ups next week. 3 lessons to teach. A benefit concert in 2 months. The scholarship fund needed his input on applicants. His life was full in a way it hadn't been in 20 years. But tonight, he'd needed this. Needed to remember where he came from. Needed to prove to himself that success hadn't changed who he was at his core. He was Tyrell Washington. He'd been a prodigy and a homeless street musician, and now something in between. He'd lost everything and survived. He'd been invisible and found his voice again, and he was still here, still playing, still believing that music could change things, still believing that everyone deserved to be heard. The city stretched out around him full of stories and struggles and hidden beauty, full of people who needed art, even if they didn't know it, full of gifts waiting to be discovered if anyone bothered to look. Tyrell smiled, adjusted the keyboard on his shoulder, and continued home. Tomorrow was another day. Another chance to make music. Another opportunity to remind the world that talent doesn't care about circumstances, that beauty can emerge from brokenness, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most unexpected places. The streets had taught him to survive. But music had taught him how to live.